Greetings, Embers, and welcome to Back to Ashes. My name is Phoenix. I'd like to give a very special thank you to the reformed members of the channel. Luz Crispin, Tammy Slayton, CAG, Denise S., Through Scrutiny, Samantha Place, Stephanie McLaren, Corpse Lover, Normie DW, Christy Elias, Cindy Cleveland, and Patty's niece. If you would like to learn how to become a member of the channel or buy me a coffee as a special thank you, those links can be found down below. Also, if this is your first time here and you like what you are hearing, or you've already been here and haven't done so already, please don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment. Not only does it help support the channel, but it also reminds you of every time I upload a video. With all of that being said, it is time to go back to ashes. For once we arise from the ashes, we are a bigger, brighter, stronger, and a happier person in the morning. This, dear Embers, is the series I was telling you about. It has exactly 111 stories. I'm not sure how many parts that's going to come out to be, but each video will contain at least an hour's worth of narration, sometimes an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours. It just depends on how I'm feeling that day. So I hope you're as excited for it as I am. Now, some of you may not be a fan of fictional stories, so this series will not be for you. I will be uploading the regular videos along with this, so no worries, I still got you. Now it's time to sit back, relax, kick back, grab a snack, or tuck in and get warm, and prepare for this dose of vocal melatonin entitled A Series of Horror. Right after this intro, an ad will play. I'll read the first story an ad will play, and after that, there will be no more ads within this video. Oh yeah, P.S. This will be the only time I do the introduction to this series. When I release the others in parts, I will not be doing an intro. I will be saying hello and jumping straight into the stories. That way you can go ahead and get that vocal melatonin you always love. Let's get started, shall we? The Clapping Man. I heard he was a mute, and the clapping is how he communicates. I heard he's a ghost, and the clapping is how he gets your attention. I heard you both were big old babies who will believe in anything. Daryl and Gary looked up incredulously at me as I grinned back at them from across the lunch table. Oh yeah? Well, he's been linked to the disappearance of like 4 kids now, so it sounds like a pretty good reason to be afraid of him, Daryl said, sounding mad. I just shrugged at him, popping a french fry into my mouth and savoring the salt. There's no proof that this clapping man is responsible for a candy bar going missing at Dale's, let alone Mickey Frazier getting snatched. The clapping man story was something that had been circulating for a while. 3 young kids had gone missing first, all of them heading home from somewhere or another. And some of the witnesses had reported hearing a clapping sound before they had gone missing. One of them had even reported seeing a man-sized shape in the woods before hearing the clap. They didn't have any details about the guy, but they said it looked like a person's shadow with long arms. Mickey had been the most recent disappearance and the one that made the cops around Tiger the most nervous. The first 3 had been younger kids, elementary school kids who hadn't looked like much, but Mickey had been a 17-year-old farm kid who was built like a linebacker. The story was that he was trying to find one of his dad's missing sheep around dusk and had just never come back. The stories were that he was near Kendall Covered Bridge and that the sheep had been found dead underneath it the next day. There were the usual rumors that Mickey had run off or left to be with a girl, left to be with a boy for all they knew. But those of us who had known Mickey kind of doubted it. Mickey was slow, not like special ed slow, but he was slower than average. He loved his family, he loved working on his parents' farm, and the thought that he would just run off when he couldn't come back with a sheep was laughable. Mickey liked football too, and if his dad had asked, he had given it up in a heartbeat. The cops knew this too, and that's why they were so sure that Mickey had been taken by someone, and that the someone had to be big. The bell rang then, but we kept our seats as the good little sheep dispersed around us. We'd leave when the monitor finally told us we had to, and not a minute before. Gary still looked a little nervous as the cafeteria cleared out, but Daryl was pretty used to this. Daryl and me had been hellions since we were young, but it was a life that Gary was slowly getting used to. I'm not a bad kid. Not really. I love my mama. I respect my daddy. I keep my truck well maintained, and I'm good to my girl when I have one. That being said, I have no time for weaknesses or rules. The only rule I know is that the strong rule, and it's a rule I learned from my daddy. If I'm strong, and I am, I should be able to do what I want. If other kids don't understand that, well, that's their problem. Just like when I push them down and show them who's boss. Daryl, Gary, and me never really considered ourselves a gang or anything. But we pal around because we all believe that when you're strong, you're right. Mrs. Gladys looked our way, and I grinned at her as I waved. Mrs. Gladys is cute, but she ain't strong. She teaches home ec, and she drives a Spark. Nothing about that says strong. She's come over before and tried to talk really nice to us and get us back on the straight and narrow, but it never does any good. Eventually, she stopped trying, and when she returned and called for Mr. Gersh, the shop teacher, we took our feet off the table and started heading to class. Gersh was strong, an 8-year-old combat vet with the scars to prove it, and he was not to be messed with. We were halfway to class when the bell rang for the start of 5th period, and I looked at the boys and told them I thought we should maybe take the rest of the day off. I gotta get to math, Gary said. I don't keep at least a C, they'll kick me off the football team. Same, Daryl said with a sigh. If I don't pass that history test today, my mom says I can't run the roads this weekend. Come on, man, just come to class with us. The beers will still be there after school. I blew a big old raspberry at them and told them that if they wanted to be pansies, then I'd go drink it all up before they got there. They begged me not to go, but I was done for the day. School had never really held an appeal for me, and I had already figured I'd drop out at the end of the year and go into hauling lumber, like my uncle, or into farming like my dad. I was too dumb for the Army and too lazy for college. But at least I had figured it out a year before everyone else did. Have fun in math class then, I said, waving as I walked to the parking lot to get my truck. The little Ford Ranger Daddy had given me wasn't much, but it was fine for now. I really wanted one of those big F-350s like my uncle had. But I'd either have to save up a bunch of money or still want to have something that nice. The Ranger was fine, and I slunk out of the lot in low gear before turning and flying up the road for home. The dirt roads of Tiger were like a second home to me, and as I put the schoolhouse behind me, I thought again about just leaving on one of them for parts unknown. What was there really here for me? A dead-end job and a naggy wife, squalling kids and a mortgage I couldn't pay, a bottle of beer after work with the boys, and a loveless marriage that would hang like a shackle around my neck? Maybe a trip to Stagview if I wasn't careful, or a telephone pole in the night if I had one too many beers. I didn't like to think too much about the future then, preferring to live in the moment, and this particular moment was about to contain a 12-pack of beer. I pulled in behind the bar so Daddy wouldn't see me if he came home early. Daddy was at the farmer's market till around 4, selling his wares, and I figured he wouldn't be the wiser of me cutting school. I walked off into the field of peanuts, this year's crop, and on into the woods beyond. I had been exploring the woods since before I was potty trained, and the spot I knew of was about a mile back in an old tangle of trees. Daryl and me had found it when we were still small enough to squeeze between the roots of the snaky trees and make a clubhouse down there. And it now served as a spot for us to drink and smoke and bring girls to for some privacy. The forest was familiar, an old friend that had protected me sometimes when Daddy had a little too much to drink. And before I knew it, I could see the old grove of trees in the distance. Most of the forest was thick old oaks and some scraggly little pulp trees. But the grove was different. It was old, felt anxious somehow, and being there made me feel peaceful, like nothing could hurt me while I was there. I got to the snaky trees and took a seat on the comfy old roots that stuck above ground, reaching into the gnarled old root system and pulling out the 12-pack of Budweiser. I cracked the first can and drank it quickly, smacking my lips as the crisp taste filled my stomach. This was the good life right here, and I knew it wouldn't last forever. I'd have to trade this kind of carefree time for adulthood soon enough, and the thought of saying goodbye to the snaky tree grove was a little sad. I opened a second one, drinking it slower this time, and as the wind rustled the leaves around me, I felt a yawn creeping up my throat. Daddy and me had been splitting wood before school today, and the early morning and the lukewarm beer was starting to make me groggy. As the second one disappeared and the third one popped open, I got comfy and watched the dragonflies and little forest animals frolic in the boughs of the trees. I felt at ease, like I was floating. And when the beer can slipped out of my hand and fell into the nest of roots, I was snoring before it dumped its delicious contents on the ground. When I woke up, it was dark and the sound of birds and squirrels had been replaced with insects and the scamper of bats. This didn't immediately put me off. I'd been in the woods at night before. Daryl and me had camped out tons of times, and I'd even slept rough a time or two if Mommy and Daddy were fighting. I pulled myself out of the tangle of roots and wobbled a little over to get my bearings. I wasn't drunk, not by a long shot, or hungover. I had taken a long nap in the woods, and now it was time to go home and face the music. The school would have called by now and told them I had left early. Daddy would have looked for me during evening chores and not found me, and these things would have culminated in him having a drink as he waited for me, so I was likely in for a bad time. I walked out of the grove and watching my step as I went, and that was when I first heard it. A loud pop sound that made me freeze in place and listen like a spooked deer. I stopped for a count of 5, waiting for it to come again, so I could identify it. But all I heard was the quiet sounds of the evening woods. I started walking again, but after 5 more steps, I heard the loud pop again. I had thought it might be a tree branch cracking at first, but now it sounded more like something familiar. It wasn't a natural sound, not like a branch breaking or rocks bumping as they fell. This was the sound I hadn't really heard before. A sound I was familiar with but seemed alien in nature. It sounded like someone bringing their hands together for a single hard clap. I kept walking towards the house, thinking I was hearing things. But the longer I went, the more I heard the clapping sound. It was infrequent. Always that one loud pop. And when I looked, there was nothing I could find that would have made that noise. The longer I walked, the more freaked out I got at the popping. I found myself looking for man shapes in the woods, thinking about what the kids had told the cops. It was big, like something's shadow standing in the woods. Its arms were longer than usual, and they had heard a clapping sound before their friends had disappeared. Pop. I stopped again. It had been closer this time. It sounded like it was about 20 feet away, and the clap had silenced many of the forest creatures that had been buzzing placidly. I wanted to run, but I made myself walk so I didn't trip into a hole or knock myself unconscious with a low-hanging branch. There was also the fact that these were my woods. Nothing bad could happen to me in my woods. No one could hurt me here. No one would dare to. Pop. Now it was closer, 10 feet or better. It was following me, and I was still half a mile from home. I wondered how far it would let me get before it snatched me. Would they find any evidence that I had been alive? Would they ever find anything? Pop. I quickened my pace. Holes be damned. I needed to go. I needed to get out of here. I needed to be behind my door with the lock thrown and the bolt pushed in. I'd hug my daddy and tell him I was sorry and take whatever punishment came. But I needed to know what the monster or freak or whatever was outside and couldn't get me. I ducked a branch that I saw as a vague outline and kept moving. The popping had stopped for now, but I knew I wasn't safe. I had to get home. I had to get home. I had to get pop. I turned my head in the direction of the sound, and there he was. He was man-shaped, that was for sure. He looked like a bulky man, his arms and legs just thick outlines in the murk. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them on me. He didn't make a sound, but the longer I stayed still, the more I began to hear a low murmur, like a TV show trying to break through the static. I thought he might be frozen by my stare, but as I watched, he raised his hands slowly and brought them together with a single hard clap. Pop. I took off like a shot. I ran and ran and ran as the popping followed me. I expected that every step would be my last. A claw would come out or a set of teeth would clamp down on me and I would be dragged away to whatever served it as a den for digestion or God knew what else. The popping started coming from directly behind me and I could almost feel the air of those massive hands. I could see lights coming into view up ahead and thought I might have gotten turned around and found the highway. I didn't care. I just wanted someone to help me escape this creature, and I wasn't choosy about who. I broke through the tree line to discover that I had come out on the edge of my parents' farm, and the lights were flashlights as people looked for me. They were calling my name as they got closer to the woods, and I tore off towards the field in an attempt to stop them from entering. One of them could have just as easily been the thing's next meal, and I wasn't about to draw them to it. I found Daddy first, his beam turning to fix me, and he wrapped me in a hug as he recognized me. God damn, boy, I was so scared you'd been took. He hugged me close, and the first time I'd ever seen my daddy show that kind of emotion. And when he called out to them that he had found me, I saw them all start heading to his location. The police came and talked to me, and I don't know if they took me seriously or not. They did tell people to stay out of the woods for a while and to listen for clapping if they were alone. Mickey was the last kid to go missing in Tiger that year, and when the clapping has come back after that, they seemed better prepared for it. That experience changed me, and I'm glad to say it was for the better. I started taking my schooling a little more seriously, stopped being so impetuous, started helping people instead of taking, and changed my way of thinking a lot. I still believe that strong people are important, but now I also believe that they have a responsibility to help those who aren't strong. I started volunteering to go out on woodland rescues, searching for people who'd gotten lost or looking for remains, and I got approached by the Park Service to see if I wanted to work with them. Now I help educate people so they don't get lost, and I help find those who go missing. In a way, I guess I owe the clapping man a debt. He saved me that night from becoming a monster too, though I doubt it was his intention. Shadows on the wall. When I was a kid, I lived in a haunted house. I know how that sounds, and I don't want to sound pedantic, but I lived in an actual haunted house. It was never anything sinister throughout most of my childhood. You would see things out of the corner of your eye. You'd come downstairs to find things moved a little. My mom even had her hair pulled in the bathtub once, but it was an isolated incident that never happened again. You'd hear voices, people moving around, and some other noises, but it was nothing major. It was annoying sometimes, but I never really felt threatened by it. It was just something that happened until my parents decided to sell the house. I was about 18 or 19 years old, and I had dropped out of college. Medical studies hadn't been for me, and I was just really feeling burnt out and kind of lost. I'd been writing since I was like 8, but I hadn't discovered horror yet, and was still trying to hash out something in the fantasy trade. I had a job, and I had my parents' house to fall back on, at least until they informed me that they were moving 2 states away. They didn't have a sell-by date for the house yet, but my parents were doing well enough that they could afford to go ahead and pick up another house to flip while they were waiting for this one to sell. They offered me a pretty sweet deal: stay at the house and watch the dogs while they went and got the house ready to move. They'd be back in about 2 or 3 months after they had everything ready, and then they would start moving everything up there officially. If they hadn't sold the house by then, I was more than welcome to keep living in it for a while. This turned out to be moot since I didn't stay in the house longer than about a month. It started out with little things. Things are always gone missing in the house: car keys, coffee cups, and books, but now they were nowhere to be found. I lost my car keys 3 different times in that month, and each time I had to go to the dealership to get a new one made to the tune of about $50. My school textbooks that I was going to sell to a classmate also went missing, as did my Game Boy and a bill that I have been planning on playing to keep myself out of debt. That's just the stuff I can remember, but it wasn't a constant struggle waking up wondering what was going to be missing. The dogs also got very nervous in the house. My parents kept border collies, 2 of them, and they have always been welcome in the house, along with the other menagerie of animals that my mother kept. They had never been uncomfortable coming in and out before, but now they seemed to want to live on the back porch rather than in the house. The Florida heat is no joke, and when a long-haired dog would rather sleep on an unair-conditioned back porch than inside, you know something is going on. I also chalked it up that they had missed my parents, but I had no idea that it was about to start rattling up. That was about the time that I noticed the shadows. I slept upstairs more than downstairs, feeling safer upstairs in case someone decided to break in. We had neighbors who were less than reputable, and our house had been broken into while we were out on vacation before. I figured that if someone broke in, being upstairs would give me more time to get my gun ready and call the police. But the real problem was already inside the house. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, awoken by a sound or by a feeling, and see things moving in the room. Not really moving in the room, I guess. I'd see the shadows on the wall as they walked behind me or around the bed. I'd turn my head to confront them, but they would never be anybody there. The room was always empty, and a search of the house will prove that no one was in there. What's more, even though they were on the back porch, I knew the dogs would pitch a fit if they smelled someone in the house. They might not have liked being in there, but they didn't like anybody else being in there either that they didn't know. I tried sleeping on the couch, but it was the same problem. I'd hear whispery voices and see long shadows up the wall, but when I turn over to confront them, they'd be gone. Sometimes I'd hear things moving around if I slept downstairs, so I always made a habit of sleeping upstairs. Most nights, I tried to have friends over, people to watch movies with, people to keep the company while I was in the house. But most every night, I wound up staying there by myself. I'd stay at friends' house sometimes, but never for very long. I had responsibilities at the house, and none of their parents were ready for a long-term house guest. I should have left after the shower incident, but I managed to talk myself out of it. I really wanted to believe I had just scratched myself on something. No one wants to believe their childhood house is haunted by hateful spirits. I was in the shower about 3 weeks after they left. I was getting ready for work, soap in my hair, soap in my eyes, when suddenly something scratched my shoulder. I opened my eyes and immediately regretted it, but I started looking around to see if maybe one of the cats scratched me or if I had run up on a hook or something. Mom had little hooks on the wall for the loofahs and things, but they had already been taken down. I didn't see any cats or anything in the bathroom, and I went back to cleaning the soap off myself before inspecting the scratch. It was from my shoulder blade to mid-back, and it looked like 3 long scratches that looked red and a little infected. I put ointment and a Band-Aid over them. Mom was a nurse, so she had lots of stuff like that in the craft room, and tried to ignore it. It was just an accident after all. These things happen, and I fed the dogs and went to work as I always do. When I got in that night, that's when the weirdness really hit a fever pitch. The second I came through the door, it was around midnight. I could swear I heard people upstairs. It sounded like 4 or 5 of them moving around on the second story. I grabbed my dad's gun that I kept by the TV stand and headed upstairs to have a look. I hadn't seen any signs of a break-in, no broken windows or open doors, and I wondered how they had gotten in without being seen. My parents had a big house, but most of the easier entryways are in the living room, unless these guys broke into a back room. I didn't figure they could have gotten in without me noticing. I came up the stairs, Beryl leading the way, but as I spun into the large front room where my parents slept, there was no one there. I searched the house, upstairs and downstairs, but I found nothing. It was as if I had imagined the whole thing. The dogs sleeping peacefully on the back porch led me to believe I was just getting jumpy. And as I was getting ready for bed, I couldn't help but listen out to make sure that it was just my nerves. When something kicked the front door in, I jumped about a foot. I have been washing my face in the sink, and I winced as the soap got into my eyes yet again. I came downstairs, several at a time, and the gun back out front to find the door open, and no one was there. I had expected to hear footsteps as I came down the stairs, maybe even people running, but there was no one. It was an empty house with nothing in it. I made another pass of the house, but still found nothing. I was getting jumpy, really not liking what was going on here, and it was getting hard to get ready for bed. I brought the dogs back inside, little as they wanted to come in, and tried to coax them upstairs with me so I could feel like I had a little company. I had known these dogs our whole life. I helped my mom raise them from puppies, and it was the first time that I heard them growl at me as they stoically refused to go upstairs. They didn't snap, but I got the feeling that if I pressed the matters further, they might. I finally left them downstairs, deciding to close my bedroom door and get some rest. I put a chair under the front door as well. No sense waking up to it slamming open again, if I could help it. I managed to get some sleep after some unsuccessful tossing, but when I did, it was short-lived. In my dreams, people were standing around me whispering. I didn't know who they were. They were people I had never met. And when I rolled over to look at them, They had no faces. They were made of shadows, and I got the feeling they were talking about me. I can't explain why. There's no reason I have to feel that way, but I suddenly knew that I was the subject of their conversation. I rolled over in my dream, not wanting to look at them. And that's when I saw the shadows riding up the wall. They danced and capered across the flat eggshell paint, and I realized I wasn't sleeping anymore. I could feel eyes on my back as I shivered under the covers, and the more awake I came, the more I realized I could still hear the whispered voices. These are the things I've been seeing when I tried to go to sleep every night, and as I came awake, I found the shadows were still there. They were rising up the wall, 7 or 8 feet tall, and their legs stretched out behind them grotesquely. I don't know what they were saying, but I didn't like it. It was something like muttering, a constant flow of a low talk. And when I turned to look at them, they didn't disappear this time. I couldn't see them, no more than I believed they could see me, but I knew that they were looking at me. I was filled with the most profound terror I had ever experienced. I don't know what to do. Did I stay? Did I go? This was my home. I had always felt welcome there, and this was the first time I had ever felt it would ease in the house. In the end, I chose not to confront them. I rolled out of bed as quick as I could and ran for the door. The dogs looked at me like I was crazy as I went downstairs, but I didn't really care. I was not staying in that house for another minute. I went to my car, opening the door, but remembering that I left my keys inside. I looked back at the house, but the thought of going back in there made my knees weak. There were no astral lights in the windows, no weird figures looking down at me. But looking at the dark house by night made me never want to go back in there again. I slept in my car till morning, and after the sun came up, I went to go get my keys and a few other things. I called a friend of mine and asked if I could spend the night at his place indefinitely. And after telling him what I experienced, he agreed. I don't think he believed me, but I think he believed I had seen something. His mom was the kind of person that believed in almost anything. And when he told her, she insisted that I come to stay. I stayed at his house until my parents sold the place, and then I went to live with my grandma until I got a place of my own. I thought I might be done with the weirdness in the house, but it had one last surprise for me. I went back a few weeks later to help them start moving their things onto the truck, and when we lifted the sectional, I found something. Underneath the couch was everything I had been missing, stacked into neat piles and just waiting to be discovered. My dad laughed about it, saying I must be kind of scatterbrained, but I knew I had checked under the couch many times. I helped them move their stuff onto the truck, but insisted on being gone before dark. They thought I was being silly, but I never came back there after dusk ever again. When they sold the house a few months later, I got my stuff out and never went back. My mother got into ghost tours and things later in life. I did some research on the place after I told her what I had experienced. She was almost giddy when she told me about the checkered past of the house that we have lived in. Several people had died in that house, and not all of them were of natural causes. There were rumors that 2 brothers had a duel in the backyard, and one of them was still buried on the property. A boy drowned in the pond that sits at the corner of our land. Several people died of natural causes in the house, and whether or not they are the ones haunting the place, I don't know. I find sometimes in my life that strangeness follows me. It seems to seek me out, and I think they might have been a part of the reason I started writing horror. The closer I get to understanding it, the more I know I'll understand my own reasons behind it. And that's not the only strange thing that's ever happened in my life. Perhaps I'll tell you about a few more other stories, but that can wait for another time. Mr. Danver. I hadn't thought about it until last week, but it seems to have snowballed into something that's gotten out of control. I was looking through some photos while helping my mother move when I saw him for the first time in 15 years. Dad had passed away a few months ago, and Mom was just starting to clean out some of his things. The picture had been taken at a birthday party, my 9th birthday party, and it showed my friends and I standing in front of the house and smiling as my mom took the picture. There were about 9 of us, all wearing party hats with ice cream mustaches under our noses, but the happy faces of my friends and I weren't what had caught my eye. It was the gaunt man standing in the window of the living room, the one looking out at us with the empty black eyes and the sinister smile. A man who had haunted my childhood, though I had never quite believed in him after the age of 12. Mr. Danver, a specter that my late father had brought to life. I remember the first time I ever heard of Mr. Danver, and the memory made my skin crawl. It wasn't scary because of what I had been told, but because of the unwilling way that my father had shared it. I was 5 and we were getting ready to go to preschool. I hadn't slept well that night before, and I was cranky as I sat at the table and picked at my breakfast. I was wearing half my school clothes, 1 sock, no shoes. And I was so far from being ready that when my father saw me, you could just tell he knew we were going to be late. "Come on, kiddo, we need to get a move on. Finish your breakfast, get your clothes on, find your shoes, and let's get on the road." I don't even remember what I said to him. Something snarky and grumpy, and when he turned back to me, he spoke before he had quite made up his mind to. "You better hurry and get ready before Mr. Danver comes to get you." The silence that hung after that statement was enough to make me turn my head to look at him. And that's why I saw him when he slowly put a hand over his mouth. He was looking at me like he'd just sworn, and he was afraid I would start repeating it. He seemed terrified by the notion of what might suddenly come out of my mouth. Who's Mr. Danver?" I asked, and that seemed to seal the deal. Dad went rigid, not all at once, but slowly, like something petrifying. His eyes stared out at nothing, his mouth opening a little bit as he gasped slightly. His body seemed to be trying to fight whatever was going on and failing, his mind railing against the inevitable. He looked like a landed fish, something struggling to breathe even as it struggled with the hook that had pulled it from the waters of life. And when I asked the question a second time, the hook seemed to find its anchor and he stopped fighting. "He comes for bad kids, naughty kids, and kids who don't listen. He finds where they hide and they all go missing. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be aware. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be scared. He's tall and old with skin so thin, his gray as wisps, gray as tin. His teeth are sharp, his eyes are black. He'll drag you off and you'll never come back. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be aware. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be scared." He delivered it all in the well-trained cadence of an off-Broadway actor at an audition. It sounded like something he had repeated 1,000 times, and I realized even then that it was something I would never forget. The scariest part about it wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. The voice was so different from Dad's that it was like watching a ventriloquist talk through him. Suddenly, I felt like a stranger was in the house, and I shuddered as a cold chill ran through me. I didn't say anything in the face of that silence, but when I lifted a hand to my eyes, I realized I was crying. Large, silent tears were sliding down my face, and as my dad came out of his trance, he started crying too. He came to scoop me into his arms and press me into his chest as he repeatedly said the same thing again and again into my corn silk hair. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. God help me. I'm sorry. When Mom came home to find us both watching Disney movies on the couch, she asked why he had called out of work and not taken me to school. When he explained the situation in soft tones as he pressed his mouth against her ear, she joined us on the couch and pulled me onto her lap. That was the first night I saw the old specter, but it wouldn't be the last. I woke up with the most profound chill I've ever felt. It ran up one of my cheeks like mice feet, and my eyes opened as I lay in my bed. The room was dark, my toys casting shadows across the floor as the moon crept in through the window, but I knew these spooky shapes were not the source of my discomfort. I could almost imagine that I heard the song Dad had sang as it scampered in with the air conditioning in the vent. I could see the dust mites in the moonbeam as they boogied to that haunting chorus, and as I stared at them, that's when I saw him. He was hunkered in the corner, his knees against his chest and his arms resting on his knees. He was looking at me from the pit of the shadows where he sat, and when he realized I was looking at him, I saw a wide grin stretch across his face. His toothy mouth stretched ear to ear, and as he stood up, I could hear his joints popping like kindling wood. His hair sat neatly on his head, looking like the hair you saw on zombies in horror movies, and it brushed the ceiling as he stood. He rose until his head nestled in the corner of the ceiling, his frame all 8 feet tall of it. He had a hat in his hand, a round thing I would later learn was called a bowler hat, and his arms were covered by a rich black suit coat. He was wearing a suit beneath, but I was only vaguely aware of it. As he rose, the moon casting his features in contrast, I was mesmerized by his eyes. They were dark pits of shadow that looked at me with mirthful knowledge. "Sorry to wake you," he said, his voice sounding like someone who's lost their breath to excitement. "I just wanted a peek. I'm sure I'll get a closer look sometime. Toodaloo." I started screaming then, and when Dad came in and turned the light on, there was nothing in the corner but the star stickers that stuck to the ceiling above the spot. Those stickers never glowed again, and I took them down when I noticed and threw them away. I was afraid he had gotten his taint on them. Dad pulled me into a hug, Mom beside him and hugging me too in an instant, and both of them held me until the shaking stopped. After that, I saw him anytime I did something disobedient. Sometimes I would see him lurking in the corner of my vision if I said something smart to my mom or dad. Sometimes I would feel those black eyes watching me if I didn't do my chores on time. There were a few times when I heard him laughing after I'd gotten angry at my mom, and I was always quick to apologize and make things right. Mr. Danver made me conscious of my actions in a way that I had never been before, and I was a better person because of it. I never saw him when I was rude to my friends, but just the knowledge that he might be watching made me forgive more often, and I was less likely to be cruel to others. Sometimes when I thought about cheating on a test or taking something from a store, I would imagine him just waiting to get to me and think better of it. It all culminated when I was 12, on the day I ran away from home. I had been looking forward to a sleepover at my friend's house that weekend, an event that was highly anticipated. Matt had one of these for his birthday every year, and a bunch of us would go to his house and eat junk food and watch movies and tell scary stories and just have the time of our lives. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, and I knew that if Mom found the math test at the bottom of my bag, one with a big red F on it, I could hang it up. I had buried it deep into my backpack, but not deep enough, apparently. She had found it before I could make my escape to the party, and we got into a screaming match over it. It was unfair, I told her. I had looked forward to this party for so long, and it wasn't fair that now I didn't get to go. She said that it was too bad, and that if parties were more important than my schoolwork, then I needed to get my priorities in order. I was so mad, so furious with my mom, that I did the unthinkable before I could remember the specter of Mr. Danver. I told her I was going whether she gave me permission or not, and walked out the door before she could stop me. I ran up to the light, heading for Matt's house, listening to my mom call from behind me. I expected her to be angry. I expected her to be upset. Instead, she just sounded scared. She told me to come back, that we could talk about this, but I was in no mood to listen. I was going to the party, whether she liked it or not, and nothing was going to stop me from getting there. It wasn't until I saw him standing under the burnt-out street lamp that I remembered the looming threat of Mr. Danver. When it began to flicker, I realized it had a little more juice in it. In the flickering light, I could see the tall, thin frame as he grinned at me, his translucent skin clinging to his face like a mask. He had his hat in his hand again. His immaculate suit still looked pristine in the flickering light, and his eyes reflected the flicker like a stuffed animal. He looked unreal standing in the everyday world, like a piece of Halloween decor that's a little too well made. He was utterly still, his head brushing the bottom of the lamp, but his fingers gave away his excitement. They drummed on the brim of the hat, and it made him look like a dog preparing to yank his lead and give chase. We stood there looking at each other for a count of 5 before I turned and shot off towards home. Mr. Danver was coming after me just as fast, but his lack of footfalls made me panic all the more. I turned to look and saw the two tall thing eating up the ground. His long legs moved like a spider's, and he ran like a cartoon character in big, exaggerated gallops. He was gaining on me with every step, his strides twice my own, and I screamed in frustration and terror as I put on an extra burst of speed. To think that a moment of frustration was going to seal my fate forever. I had been hyper-fixated on my brother for so long, and now a sudden lapse in judgment was going to kill me. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be aware. The wind seemed to bring the hateful words to my mind as it rushed past my ears. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be scared. I was scared, all right. I was terrified. And when my house came into view, I was afraid that I would get snatched within view of the front door. Mr. Danver would reach out with one long arm and pull me into the darkness, and I would be gone forever. It would happen just that quick, and no one would know what had gotten me. Correction, my parents would know. They would know, but how could they tell anyone? To admit to such would make them sound nuts, and probably make people think that they were responsible for my disappearance. I turned suddenly, going through the gate and running up the walk, and I felt the icy chill of Mr. Danver's hand as he passed inches from me. I took the steps 2 at a time, praying the door would be unlocked, and when Mom threw it open, I leaped into her arms. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Please, please, don't let him take me." I pressed my face against hers, not daring to look back out into the yard. Mom whispered that she forgave me, but when she talked to Mr. Danver, her voice was a mixture of rage and old fear. "Get out of here. All is forgiven. There is no misdeed. You cannot take him." I kept my face pressed against my mom, and I still heard Mr. Danvers' spidery voice when he answered her. Another time then." And when I peeked back, he was gone. Dad came home an hour later, getting off early after Mom called him, but I was still shaking and sobbing on the couch. "Why?" I asked him when he came to join me. "Why did you ever tell me about Mr. Danver?" My dad was quiet for a bit, thinking about his answer, before sighing and saying, "Because it's not something I meant to do. It happens, and someday it will happen to you as well." "Never," I whispered. "I would never do that to my child." I shuddered as he wrapped me in a hug, but I didn't pull away. "Oh, sweetie, you won't have a choice. I didn't have a choice. My father didn't have a choice. No one has a choice. Once you know about him, the knowledge demands to be shared. His name is dark knowledge, a secret shared by many, and it must be served." That's when he told me how he had come to know about Mr. Danver from his father. "I was playing with something on the couch when Dad told me to clean my room. I ignored him, wanting to finish my game. And when he said that if I didn't go do it now, he would call Mr. Danver, I looked up when he said it, and the look on his face was confused and afraid. Dad, well, your grandpa, wasn't always the nice guy that you knew. He joined AA when I was in high school, but before that, he was just drunk. He could be a mean drunk too, and I should have known better than to hesitate when he asked me to do something. Instead, I asked who Mr. Danver was, and when he sang me the little song, it was the soberest I had seen him until that point. The words were forced out of him like vomit, and when he finished, he threw his arms around me and told me how sorry he was. Dad looked at me then, and his eyes were hollow pits. I saw him in my room that night, and it wasn't the last time either. He told me that when he'd told the story to Mom, the one about his father telling him about Mr. Danver, she had cried and said she had seen him too. Her dad told her too, and one day you'll tell your kid. You won't want to, but you won't have a choice. The song is as inevitable as Mr. Danver. What you got there?" I jumped as Mom came in and found me looking at the picture. I put it in my pocket, not wanting to remind her about Mr. Danver, if I could help it. I moved on to another box, Mom taking the box of photos I'd been looking through, and I tried to put the name out of my mind. It was easy to do as I worked, but as I sat at home later, still sore from a day of moving furniture and sorting boxes, I started thinking more about it. If my parents and I knew about Mr. Danver, did anyone else? I pulled up Reddit and made this post before I could think better of it. I didn't think if you could transfer the knowledge like this, but I wanted to know bad enough to find out. "Hey guys, just remembered something from when I was a kid, and I wanted to know if anyone had ever heard of it. My dad told me a spooky story about Mr. Danver when I was a kid, saying he would come get me My mom knew about it too, but I was wondering if it was something anyone else had heard of or if it was something he made up. I had barely sat for 5 minutes before I got a response. It wasn't the last either. Yeah, my dad told me about him when I was little. Seems like I must have had nightmares about it, because I can remember dreaming he was in the corner of my room sometimes. Oh my God, so weird. That was exactly when my mom called it too. She was weird when she told me to. I thought she was having a seizure. My uncle used to tell me that he would come get me if I was bad. Wasn't there a song or poem that went along with it too? Yeah, it was pretty catchy, but I can't remember all the words. On and on and on. The thread had around 100 comments, and not all of them were from Americans either. Mr. Danvers seemed to be something that lived in the consciousness of most English-speaking people, and even if it had a different name, the descriptions they gave were exactly the same. Tall, suited, pale, wispy hair, sharp teeth, black eyes. The description was universal, and the idea that I wasn't alone didn't make me feel any better. If you too have experienced Mr. Danvers, it's already too late. One day you will tell your children. One day they will have the knowledge. One day, if they are lucky enough to avoid the icy grip of Mr. Danvers, they too will pass it on. The cycle always continues, whether you want it to or not. One day, I too will infect my child with the looming specter of Mr. Danvers. And that, dear listeners, brings a close to a series of horror stories. If you are sleeping, I hope Slumberland is treating you comfortably. If you're awake, I hope you've enjoyed this selection. Until then, please take care of yourselves, and I'll be reading to you soon. Have yourself a good morning, a good afternoon, or good evening. Peace, love, and light to you all.